So aloha, everyone. Thank you guys for joining our South Kohala speaker series. The South Kohala Coastal Partnership includes over 70 partners, government agencies, community partners, NGOs, and we have started this series to bring in guest speakers to share information with anyone interested. And it looks like we have people from all across the Hawaiʻi today, so thank you for joining. My name is Rebecca Most, and I'm the Nature Conservancy's Program Director for Hawaii Island Marine Program, and we help facilitate the South Kohala Coastal Partnership. And so today's talk is reviewing the 2021 legislation for ocean legislation for bills that became law. And we have our guest speaker is David Sakoda. So David Sakoda is the Fisheries Program Manager for the state of Hawaii, Department of Land and Natural Resources in the Division of Aquatic Resources. So he oversees the Division of Aquatic Resources commercial and recreational fisheries programs and serves as DAR's legislative and administrative rulemaking coordinator. So David has been with DAR since 2013, first as a legal fellow and then as a program specialist. David is a 2010 graduate of the William S. Richardson School of Law with a certificate in environmental law. He's also an avid free dive spear fisherman and ocean enthusiast with a passion for sustainable fisheries management. So I just want to mahalo David for your time today to share this presentation with the South Kohala Coastal Partnership and guests. And I will turn it over to you to share your screen. And just to let everyone know, if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll be monitoring the chat. And we'll have time at the end to go through your questions and do a Q&A session. Thank you, David. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Becca. Good to see a lot of familiar faces or names if your cameras are off. But yeah, thanks, Becca, for inviting me to share. I just put together a presentation. Let me share it now. And this is to go over the bills that became law last year. And then I can also comment on the status on some of those as far as implementation. Okay. So this is just an overview. There were 7 administrative bills that DAR introduced that became law. 2 administrative bills introduced by DoCare that became law. And there are also a couple of other bills that related to oceans or aquatic resources that I'm going to highlight. And I'll go through these one by one. So the first one, House Bill 1016, this has to do with commercial marine vessel licenses. It's a bill that we've introduced a number of times prior to 2021. And finally, it was signed into law last year as Act 43. It provides that a single commercial marine vessel license satisfies the commercial fishing licensure requirement for all persons on board that licensed vessel. The impetus for this was small boat commercial fishermen, especially bottom fishermen, wanting to be able to cover everyone on board their boat, the captains and crew, under one license instead of having to pay for licenses for all their crew, which often have high turnover rates. So it's mostly an economical thing, but we did make it applicable to all vessels, including longline vessels. But for longline vessels, we are requiring them to report specific crew information to DLNR. Also, the existing commercial marine license requirement applies to commercial fishers and charter vessels. And we use this opportunity to clarify that the commercial marine license requirement applies to all charter services, whether it's vessel-based or shore-based, just so we can get a better understanding of who is operating fishing charters in the state for commercial purposes. And then it authorizes DLNR to establish rules and fees and required us to submit a report regarding status. So just to give everyone an update, we have not yet come up with draft regulations. We're still in the process of drafting regulations for this because we're doing a comprehensive amendment of our licensing and permitting rule chapter. So there's a number of other licenses that will be included, including the non-resident recreational marine fishing license, which is another bill I'll talk about, as well as a commercial marine dealer license. And so we're drafting all of those rules together and hopefully come up with a draft for scoping shortly. The next one, House Bill 1017, is our crustacean bill. This was signed into law also on June 8th, which was World Ocean Day, as Act 44. And it repeals the statute that prohibits the taking or killing of female spiny lobsters, kona crabs, and Samoan crabs, because we incorporated those prohibitions into our administrative rules. So the statute was no longer necessary. And our intent is to change the rules now that the statute's repealed to allow the take of female kona crab. Based on science and management in other places, it's been shown that effective management has to do with regulating the season where the crabs reproduce and come further inshore, and also size. So we're keeping the size limits and the seasonal closures, but proposing to allow the take of females. Currently, it's still illegal to take females because it's on our rules, but we intend to change our rules probably within the next few months. House Bill 1018 gives us authority to establish a laynet permit requirement for the use of laynets in state waters. Again, this was signed on June 8th as Act 45. It authorizes us to establish rules for laynet permit. So we're in the process. We've gone to the board for approval for public hearings. We've held one public hearing, and internally we've decided that some of the definitions are a little problematic. And so we're going back to the board actually this Friday to ask that they revise the rules before holding a second set of public hearings. Basically, we want to focus the issue on this laynet permit. We're keeping the rest of the laynet regulations and definitions the same, but we are taking the opportunity to do some housekeeping amendments. So within that rule chapter, there's things like using a firearm to take sharks, but because of the bill that bans the take of sharks, we're removing that, and other housekeeping amendments. So that's kind of the status of the laynet permit rules. And the purpose of the permit is to make laynetting regulations more enforceable. Currently, people are required to register their nets, but it's a one-time registration. There's no annual requirement. So we don't know really how many registered nets are still being used. And with the registration, we cannot revoke it. They can be convicted of a violation and continue to use nets or continue to register new nets. But with a permit, it's a permit to participate in a fishery and to use a certain gear. And if there's poaching or violations going on, we have the ability to suspend or revoke that permit. which will hopefully increase compliance with LANET laws. House Bill 1019. This was a pretty significant bill for us. It establishes an ocean stewardship special fund and user fee. It was signed into law as Act 46. Basically, how it works is any commercial use permit holder that has a CUP from our Division of Boating and Ocean Recreation would collect a small per head fee, $1, from each passenger or customer that they serve. And that dollar gets deposited into a special fund that's managed by DAR. And the funds can be used for marine resource conservation, restoration, enhancement, research, regulatory measures, enforcement actions, education, or any other management measure that's intended to conserve, restore, and enhance marine resources in state jurisdiction. So it's pretty broad. Can also be used for restoration and compensatory mitigation measures, for impacts to the marine environment, and to install, maintain, and replace day-use mooring buoys and other infrastructure to reduce impacts to the marine ecosystem. So the idea is we want this fee to benefit ocean users. Indeed, there's a lot of ocean users that are benefiting from our nearshore resources. A lot of commercial operators that are benefiting from the business of taking tours out. And so we want those users to contribute to some of the impacts that they're having to ensure that we can manage our resources well. But not only that, but we also want to make sure that we provide a good experience for those users, and hence restoring the environment, maintaining infrastructure that enables them to enjoy those resources. Some things that got put into the bill that we weren't asking for was a sunset date to this special fund. So the ocean stewardship fee won't start being collected until 2024, and then it's a 5-year program that sunsets in 2029. So our goal is to prove that it works, prove that we're using the funds well and managing our ocean resources well, and then hopefully ask the legislature to repeal the sunset date. But at least this gives us a 5-year period to prove that it's worth it and that it has a benefit to the resources and to the users. House Bill 1020, this was another innovative piece of legislation. It was signed as Act 49, and it authorizes the BLNR to temporarily adopt, amend, and repeal certain natural resource rules by formal action at a public meeting. So it would bypass the Chapter 91 rulemaking process, and the trigger or justification is if the board finds that such adoption, amendment, or repeal is necessary to implement effective and adaptive management measures in response to rapidly changing resource conditions. Many times, there's resource conditions that change quickly, and we're unable to address the causes of those changes, or implement regulations to counteract those changes through the normal Chapter 91 rulemaking process, because it's a lengthy process that requires months of scoping and approvals and everything. And by the time rules are in place, the conditions have either come back to normal, or it's too late to really save the resource. And so there is some emergency rulemaking authority, but it's very specific and limited. So this adaptive management authority provides greater flexibility. And we wanted to balance it, with the public notice and input process. That's also a very good thing for democracy, getting public feedback. So we limited the scope of this authority, so it only applies to size limits, bag limits, closed seasons, and gear restrictions, both for fishing and hunting. And it can only be effective up to 2 years, with the ability to extend 1 year at a time. But those extensions require BLNR approval and legislative approval. And then the bill also requires a report to the legislature with how we've used this authority, and that's prior to the 2023 legislative session. So to date, DAR hasn't used this authority. I believe our Division of Forestry and Wildlife is planning to use Adaptive Management Authority to change some of its hunting regulations. And we are looking into the possibility of using it for things like coral bleaching or things like that. But for certain resource changes, there's not really management that we can implement. So it's really like a specific type of issue that this rule can address. And so we haven't identified any need to use it so far. House Bill 1023, this is also another significant piece of legislation. It requires a non-resident recreational marine fishing license, and establishes a fee schedule for this license. We still need to implement it through rulemaking, so we haven't started enforcing this yet. But this is one of the rule changes that we're planning to implement along with the commercial vessel license. The way it would work is if you're a resident and you can show proof of residency, you don't need to have a license. But if you're visiting from out of state, you're not a resident, then you'd be required to purchase one. And the idea is, state taxpayers already pay into resource management through their taxes, but these visitors, we'd also want them to pay into fisheries management. And so the revenue from these licenses will go back towards fisheries management. Significantly, they can also be used as matching funds for federal sport fish funds that we receive through the Federal Sport Fish Restoration Program. It's been a challenge in recent years to come up with adequate state match, and by having these license revenues, that'll open up a lot more opportunities for us to utilize those funds. Okay, moving on to the doe care administrative bill, or sorry, this is still the DAR one. This was just a housekeeping measure, House Bill 1030. It repealed the Aquatic Life and Wildlife Advisory Committee. We haven't convened these committees in years. And so one of the efforts by our department and a lot of other departments was to try to minimize the use of resources, and if there's any committees that weren't convening, to take them off the books and just do housekeeping. And this was something that was kind of catalyzed by the pandemic and wanting to make sure we're efficiently using the resources that we have. So we took this one off the books because we weren't using it. And in fact, we are meeting with fishers kind of informally, but we have a fishers working group that DAR meets with, and We've been convening holomua talk story sessions to try to engage with fishers. And so there's really no need for these types of advisory committees that we see because we're kind of doing that informally. But if we ever wanted to, there's no reason why we couldn't convene formal committees in the future. Okay, now moving on to the doe care legislation. House Bill 1021 authorizes DLNR to enter into the Interstate Wildlife Violator Compact. Hawaii was the last state that was not a member of this compact. So the way it works is if someone is convicted of a violation and has their fishing or hunting license revoked in one state, they would be ineligible to obtain a fishing or hunting license in any other state that's part of this compact. So it promotes the enforcement of hunting, fishing, and other wildlife-related regulations across jurisdictions. So this opens up the door. I think we're still in the process of entering into this compact, so we're not. It hasn't been finalized yet, but at least this legislation provides that avenue. House Bill 1022, this was another really significant piece of legislation for doe care. It provides authority for natural resources inspection, specifically clarifies that any doe care officer may, in the performance of official duties, stop and temporarily detain any person who the officer reasonably believes is or recently has been engaged in hunting or fishing for a natural resource inspection. So they can inspect any license, permit, stamp, or other documentation required for hunting or fishing, any game or aquatic life in their possession, including contents of containers or where aquatic life or game can be stored, and also any equipment, article, or device capable of taking game or aquatic life. And the inspection must be conducted within a reasonable distance of the environment where the hunting or fishing took place. The way it was before this authority is officers would need to establish probable cause of a violation. So if they saw somebody, say fishing on the shoreline, they'd have to observe them and see if they caught like an undersized fish and put it in their cooler in order to have probable cause that there's a violation, and then they could go and inspect the cooler. But with this, if an officer sees someone that is engaging in fishing, they can go up and just check for compliance. If they require a license, ask to see their license. If they have a cooler, ask to see the contents of the cooler. So it just makes enforcement that much more efficient. Okay, moving on, House Bill 553. This is the shark bill. It was enacted as Act 51, and it establishes an offense of intentionally or knowingly capturing, entangling, or killing a shark in state marine waters. It does provide exemptions. So take of sharks under SAPs for research or education or other purposes. Take of sharks for public safety. Take of sharks under federal permits or federal fisheries, self-defense, and non-commercial take under permits issued by DLNR. It authorizes us to adopt the rules, but we haven't done that yet. It is in our plans. We just have a ton of rulemaking priorities at the moment. But some of the rules could include ensuring that incidental capture and release is not a violation, preventing wanton waste, limiting certain gear such as gill nets in sensitive areas, etc. So that took effect at the beginning of this year. So currently, intentional or knowing take of sharks is illegal in state waters. And, you know, we look forward to doing rulemaking probably later this year or next year. And then finally, I believe this is the last slide. Senate Bill 772, this authorizes the issuance of special license plates with designs related to forest and ocean conservation, and the revenues will be deposited in special funds for forest stewardship and beach restoration. Sorry. So this is something that was suggested by fishermen in our Fishers Working Group, and we supported it. We think it's a good way that can generate revenues for conservation. Other states do it. So we still haven't implemented it yet. DOCR is working with the county police departments to implement this. But, you know, we're not sure how much it'll generate, but, you know, it'll help with conservation and resource management and even enforcement. And that's the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions on any of these.
Thank you so much, David. That's a very impressive amount of legislation that was passed last year, and thank you for recapping all those different bills. I do see some questions in the chat, and I even had some that I was jotting down as well. But for everyone else that was listening, if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll go through them. So the first one in the chat is from Jocelyn, and it's regarding HB 1023. I'm pretty sure, was that the non-resident fishing license one, David?
I think so.
So the question is, given how specific 1023 language is, wondering why it needs additional rulemaking to take effect.
And sorry, David, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I just was realizing this as I was reading it. I was like, this is a really nice piece of legislation that sort of, it all seems like it's spelled out right here. But maybe I'm missing something.
That's a great point. I mean, I think we could probably implement it without legislation. But, you know, all of our other licenses are done through rulemaking, and we want it to be consistent. We also need time to develop the licensing system, and we're planning to roll those out simultaneously. So we're developing a RFP to put that out for bid, but that's going to take a little while too, and concurrently developing the regulations for it. So there's no sense implementing a license and enforcing it if there's no way for people to purchase a license. So I guess that was a big part of it too.
Thanks, David. That makes sense. And then sticking with this bill, 1023, Alana also has a question about how many licenses do you think will be issued a year, and does it apply to charter fishing as well?
This is for the non-resident or the
for the non-resident? Yeah, for the non-resident fishing license. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think so. Based on we contracted a study by Conservation International prior to introducing this legislation, and they estimated approximately 50,000 licenses, majority of them the one-day license, but also some 7-day and annual. So roughly about $1 million a year. And it would include passengers on charter fishing vessels that are non-resident. So the charter fishing vessel could be covered under the commercial vessel license, since commercial charters are considered commercial fishers, but the clients or customers on those vessels wouldn't be covered by that license. They would need their own non-resident fishing license.
Cool.
Right on. Thank you, David.
I have a follow-up question to that. And I think you partially answered it already, but you were mentioning that you're still working out like the licensing system. Like, do you guys have a sense of what that would look like how non-residents or visitors would be able to get a license? I'm just imagining people that are like wanting to go out sport fishing, you know, and make plans the next day. Like, what kind of process is it for them to get that license that you think will be implemented?
That's a great question. Yeah, so we're trying to make it as accessible and easy as possible. So the idea is to make it 100% online, both for purchasing the license, but also like an app to display the license digitally or electronically, so that if they show up to the dock and, you know, want to jump on a charter, the captain can say, hey, if you don't have your license, just go online, purchase it here, show it to me, and then jump on board. You know, most people, especially visitors, are, you know, have access to that technology. So, you know, we don't think it'll be too much of an issue that we don't have like a paper version to go along with that.
Great. Well, I'm just checking the chat so I don't hog the mic, but yeah, if anybody has another question, please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. But I do have a few more for you, David, if you're okay to continue on with some Q&A on different bills.
Sure.
So I wrote a note down when you were talking about the rule change for the crabs. You mentioned a desire to allow female Kona crab take in the future.
Yep.
And then I was just curious, why not Samoan crabs as well, just knowing that they're not a native species? I was just curious if that was one that you were considering as well.
Yes. So that's a great question too. The primary driver behind the Kona crab is that that's a commercial fishery. It's co-managed by the federal government and DLNR, because, you know, they're both in state and federal waters, and so there's a stock assessment and a management plan, and so really the no take of females was hindering the commercial viability of that fishery, because a lot, like over 50% of the catch oftentimes would have to be released. And so it was really more of like an economic thing, where if we allowed the take of female Kona crab, it would allow for a commercial fishery that is still sustainable. And we have all these other management measures in place, like the closed season and minimum size. With the Samoan crab, it's not a commercial fishery, or not as big of a commercial fishery. Fishermen are not asking us to allow the take of females. And, you know, even though it's a non-native species, it is a food species that a lot of people target. And so at this time, we haven't been asked to open it up. And if we do, we'd have to look at whether that would be sustainable, if we can allow the take of females, and it would continue to, you know, offer a good fishing opportunity for people that like to target those.
Thanks. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm asking because Samoan crab is one of my favorite things to eat. Okay, and then I had another question about the ocean stewardship fees. I'm sure this will fluctuate year to year, but I was wondering if you guys had an expectation of how much revenue that would generate, and then would that revenue accumulate in that fund each year, so it could, or do you have to spend it each year, and the structure of that fund?
Yeah, so it would accumulate up until the sunset date, January 1st, 2029. And then if that's not changed, then any balance would revert to the general fund. And then thereafter, any user fees collected by the system would be deposited into the general fund. So we'd love to change that. I don't think we'd get approval without, proving that it works. So the other part of the question is like, do we have to spend it? So it can, I think the balance could carry on. Oh, sorry, the other question was how much we expect to.
Yeah, if you guys had a sense of how much revenue that would generate each year.
Yeah, so Conservation International also did a study. We contracted them to study this as well, this ocean stewardship fee. And the way they analyzed it was a little different. They projected over, I think it was a 15-year like time period, like what the net revenue would be. And there's a range because the study was done in the thick of COVID. And so I think if it was like with the pandemic effects and everything and tourism suppressed, then I think it was like 14 million over 15 years. And then if the economy went back to pre-COVID, then it would have been like 30 million over 15 years. So there's a range, but I think somewhere in there, maybe even closer to the higher end now that we're coming out of the pandemic. So it could generate significant revenues. We're looking at 2 to 3 million per year once it gets like fully up and running.
It's exciting. That's awesome. I see another question in the chat from Alana, that she's very excited about the shark legislation and curious where most shark catch was coming from, and also any plans to monitor how this law will impact shark populations over time.
It's a good question. So I think the driver behind this bill was certain egregious acts that were posted on social media showing like torture of sharks or like sharks left by fishermen up on the beach. And that kind of behavior is wrong. We don't want that to be happening. So the bill clearly addresses that, but really sharks are not really targeted in Hawaii. They are sometimes used for bait, like crab bait or ulua bait. They're sometimes incidentally caught by bottom fishers and retained and eaten. But really there's not really a shark fishery. So I'm hoping, and I think this bill would crack down on senseless killing of sharks. But as far as like impacts to shark populations, I don't know that it would have a huge impact, considering that this applies to state waters, and most of the impact to sharks are like on the high seas, like even beyond our EEZ, by foreign fleets who are taking sharks for finning and stuff like that. So like in the big picture, it probably wouldn't do much, but locally it might have some small impacts.
Thanks, David. And Alana says thank you as well in the chat. And then I see David Tarnas says the shark bill also includes authorization to limit setting of nets in shark nursery areas. Thanks, David. And then one other question is about the cooler inspection bill, or the inspection bill that allows enforcement officers to ask to look inside the cooler. What are the consequences, like if a fisher says, no, I don't want you to look inside my cooler? Would that mean an automatic fine or a ticket? What would the consequences look like for that?
Yeah, good question. So currently, well, prior to HB 1022 becoming law, the officer couldn't look in a cooler if the fisherman said no. Now they have that authority, and so they would be authorized, even if the person said no, they would be authorized to open up the cooler. And my understanding is doe care officers are currently going through like a training program to learn how to respond in those kind of situations. And yeah, I think the first step is like informing the fisherman or hunter, whoever it may be, of the law that the doe care officer legally has a right to inspect their cooler, and say, you know, you could receive a citation for refusing. And if they continue to refuse, even with the knowledge of the law, then they could have them step aside. They could conduct their inspection, issue a citation, etc.
Cool. All right, those are the questions I had noted down, but does anybody else have any additional questions for David? Not seeing any hands raised. Give it a moment.
I had one more, sorry to be delayed here on the video. I was thinking about the adaptive management bill, and I was just wondering, again, this is kind of, for some reason, I'm in an administrative law headspace today, about, you know, if after the 2-year period, you know, where you have the opportunity, the board has the opportunity to create a new rule for that 2-year window, if the agency sort of decides to proceed in that time frame with a rule that is the same as the rule that was sort of made using this provision, I'm wondering if that would also trigger the legislative approval piece, right? Is it sort of functionally an extension, or is it a new rule? And you know, how would we distinguish those cases? So sorry, I'm really in the weeds here on this one today for some reason.
Yeah, I don't think it would trigger the legislative approval, because it will presumably, you know, if it's a regular rulemaking that goes through the normal Chapter 91 rulemaking process, then that's sufficient. You know, they have full authority from the legislature to adopt rules through that process.
Great, thanks.
Does anyone else have any other questions for David?
I don't have a question, but I have a quick comment. Oh, Ted, you go first. Sorry.
No, Representative, you go first. You outrank me.
No, I don't outrank you at all. And that's my point, is that, you know, I'm at the legislature chairing the Water and Land Committee that heard all these bills, and we moved them out. But the only reason why we were able to be so successful is because of advocates like many of the people on this call and others in the fishery working group. It's the advocates who are out there who help me as a chair pass good legislation. And so I appreciate David's work. He's a great person to be working in DAR, and we work in collaboration between the legislature and the agency. And we really do depend on the public input on all these things. So I wanted to share the credit with everybody who was participating in the legislative process. Thanks.
And thank you and David for your work and for helping to pass a lot of good bills last year, which we supported. I wondered, David Sakoda, if you have any comments on the bills that have passed the legislature this year. And I realize they're not law yet, but what are the major ones, and what do you think?
Yeah, I was wondering if I'd get that question. I don't have any slides for those, but let's see, off the top of my head, the ones that we were tracking, there was a funding for fish aggregation devices to support, you know, those fishers, the small boat fishers that utilize them. There's a Pupukea MLCD carrying capacity study with funding appropriated for that to understand human impacts in MLCDs. There's a drone fishing ban, prohibits the use of unmanned aerial vehicles for taking aquatic resources, but allows for the use of drones for reconnaissance, and also allows for DLNR to issue permits to use drones. So that's another thing to be added to our rulemaking list, which probably won't happen in the near future, but something I know fishermen will be asking for. Let's see, there was in lieu fee mitigation. That was its authority to establish a formal in lieu fee mitigation program where planned or unplanned impacts to coral reefs can be, I guess, compensated for through payment into this in lieu fee program, and we would use those fees to do mitigation projects that are coordinated and at priority sites that we designate. So something that I think will help. We don't have immediate plans right now because we are doing a lot of piecemeal mitigation based on like settlements from reef damage events or like dredging events. But I think long term it would make sense to have like a coordinated program like that. If there's any specific ones that you want me to talk about, I'd be happy to. It just those are the main ones I think that we were following.
You might want to mention HB 1653, increasing penalties for violations.
Yes, how could I forget? House Bill 1653 strengthens penalties for aquatic resource violations. The notable points of that bill is for criminal violations, it establishes a per specimen fine. So prosecutors don't have to charge multiple offenses for take of multiple species or specimens. They can charge one offense and just add the fines. And then also it allows DLNR or the or I guess the prosecutor to recommend certain probationary terms, including like geographical restrictions from certain areas or restrictions on the use of certain fishing gear or the possession or take of certain species. Just adds to the toolkit that the courts have to deter future violations. And we're seeing that the fines that defendants are receiving for fishing violations aren't always sufficient to deter future violations, but restricting someone from going to a certain beach or possessing certain fishing gear would be a major deterrent. So we're hoping this starts to change behavior.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks, David. David, there was another question that just came in through the chat. It's from Ui down in Milili'i, and it's related to the inspection bill and Chop Chop. So the question is, would the inspection bill assist in identifying those using Chop Chop in the areas where it is restricted? Or will enforcement and not just the Makai watchers need to observe the activity of feeding Chop Chop? So
yeah, that's a tough one because I think it's the use of animal bait is prohibited in the area, not necessarily the possession, although I could be wrong. I need to go back and look at the language. But it would allow DoCare to intercept someone and ask to see if like what's in their bucket or their cooler, and if there is Chop Chop or animal products, then they can educate them on the regulations, or if they have enough probable cause that this person was actually using that bait, then they might be able to issue a citation.
See a thumbs up from Ui, so it doesn't look like she has any follow-up to that, and a mahalo in the chat from her. Great questions, everyone. Does anyone else have another question for David?
I don't have another question, but just one other funding thing we did this year, provided $300,000 and another position to DLNR's hatchery program to provide fingerlings and limu for restoration and restocking of fish ponds.
Awesome. That is exciting. The two Davids are a powerful dynamic duo in terms of pushing forward ocean legislation. So mahalo to both of you for what you do. I'm not seeing any additional questions. So looks like we might be able to wrap up a few minutes early. Just a sincere mahalo to David for all that you do at DAR and for taking time out of your busy schedule to share the updates on ocean legislation from 2021 and 2022 with the group. We will be putting this recording up on our South Kohala Coastal Partnership website so that people that weren't able to attend today can view it. And David, if you don't mind just sticking your email in the chat before we sign off in case anyone wants to reach out to you with any questions after the call. Thank you, David. So mahalo very much for all of your time, and I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day.